Thank you, Jonathan, so much for joining us. Jonathan Tobin is the editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org, with a focus on American politics and the U.S.-Israel relationship. He is a prolific writer, producing analysis and commentary for multiple major news organizations, including the New York Post, Newsweek, and the Washington Examiner. He is a frequent guest commentator on television and lectures at college campuses across America. He has been named a leading columnist for various Jewish publications and others on multiple occasions. Thank you so much and welcome, Jonathan, for coming to join us today.
Thank you, Anne. It's an honor to be able to take part in this important conference, which is on a subject that I think deserves all the attention we can give it. 20 years ago, the egregious proceedings of the Durban conference illustrated how the international community, and in particular the United Nations, had legitimized anti-Semitism. A conference whose purpose was ostensibly to oppose racism was essentially hijacked by the Palestinians and their allies, who are eager to revive the UN's since rejected libel about Zionism being racism. In an international community in which diversity and various expressions of national identity and self-determination were celebrated, only the Jews were told that the movement dedicated to their rights and self-determination was illegitimate. The labeling of Israel as an apartheid state, an outrageous libel contradicted by the facts, gained new momentum after Durban and became a totem of the success of intersectionality and ideology that became best known for its willingness to analogize the Palestinian war to destroy the one Jewish state on the planet with the struggle for civil rights in the United States and against racism everywhere. But with the passage of 2 decades, the questions that I think deserve an answer is, why has the response from the organized Jewish world to this outrageous calumny been so feeble? How is it possible that the identification of Jews with racism and apartheid has been met with what are, for the most part, perfunctory protests? How is it that the Jewish world has confronted the apartheid Israel lie that Durban helped put on the ideological map with the sort of complacence and minimal activist response that has essentially given it a pass? Is this merely a failure of public relations, or does it indicate a more profound inability to comprehend the danger that comes from allowing these ideas to go unchallenged? Or worse, to be treated as reasonable arguments? And just as important, what are the consequences of this failure? Part of the problem stems from one of the great strengths, which is also a potential weakness for Jewish groups and those tasked with defending Israel and Zionism. Judaism contains a balance of universalism and parochial concerns, but to much of the Jewish community, the former has assumed a far greater importance than the latter. Some of that manifests itself in natural and laudable impulses to demonstrate solidarity with minority groups, underdogs, and the cause of civil rights. But it has also led to a willingness to turn a blind eye to trends that are associated with such causes, but which are actually toxic to the public square and Jewish security. And it is precisely because of their diffidence in opposing anything that was somehow connected, rightly or wrongly, with what is known as anti-racism, that the apartheid libel and the intersectional arguments that underpin it have become regarded not so much as a frontal attack on Jewish security, but merely an overenthusiastic application of good principles. This willingness to not merely downplay the justice of Zionism and the injustice of the war being waged against Jewish self-determination, but to regard anti-Zionism as a legitimate point of view that deserved a hearing, despite its inherently prejudicial nature, has continued to undermine the response, not just to the spirit of Durban and the apartheid Israel lie, but to the ongoing assault on Israel in various UN forums and academic and political venues where intersectionalism has found a foothold. Liberal Jewish groups, which dominate American Jewish life at one and the same time, are too busy pursuing domestic agendas and virtue signaling their disagreements with various policies of various Israeli governments to understand that what was happening under the auspices of the UN wasn't just a meaningless exercise in third world politics or international propaganda, but an idea that had the power to delegitimize not just Israel's existence, but the rights of Jews everywhere, as those connected to the Jewish state ultimately found themselves in the crosshairs of movements determined to treat all those connected to Israel as equally at fault and equally guilty of oppression. As with so much back and forth about activist causes within the Jewish world, expressions of support for Jewish rights and opposition to anti-Semitism, which have been taken up by supporters of Palestinians, was often regarded as too assertive or parochial or insufficiently concerned about the plight of Palestinians, regardless of how often the latter had rejected Israel's offers of an independent state and peace. The question of how seriously the Jewish world takes the UN and its agencies is an important one. The UN may have a bad press, especially in the United States, but while it has long since lost the luster that its idealistic origins gave it, much of the organized Jewish world, much like the various foreign policy establishments in Washington and other Western countries, regards multilateralism and diplomacy as an end in and of itself, and regardless of whether it advances or actually sets back the causes of freedom and opposition to genuine racism. Layered into this problem is a tendency among many Jewish groups and many Jews to view anti-Semitism only through the prism of their historical memories and contemporary partisan loyalties. This leads them to seeing Jew hatred as primarily a problem of the far right, while either ignoring or minimizing the way anti-Semitism has always found a home on the left. In this manner, the efforts of the Palestinians and their third world and Islamic allies to use not merely the language of the left to delegitimize Israel's existence, but to also use structures of international organizations to pursue their goals, is largely off the radar screens of Jewish defense groups that are focused on looking for enemies among the extremists on the far right, while regarding anti-Israel and anti-Zionist invective from the left as somehow less threatening. To point out the peril to Israel from the way the left and international bodies have legitimized the libels of Zionism as racism is not to deny that anti-Semitism also exists on the right and that it can pose a genuine danger there. But the almost exclusive focus on the right, motivated in part by the partisan priorities of some of those tasked with fighting anti-Semitism, has led to a degree of complacence about the spirit of Durban, the anti-Semitism of the UN, and intersectionalism that caused it to metastasize in the last decade, almost without the anti-Semitism monitors noticing or raising enough of a protest about it. It's also true that Israeli diplomacy has largely abandoned the field of international organizations, both because its diplomats focus on other things and because the Jewish state has become inured to the influence of the UN that they know is dead set against it. The consequences of this failure are readily apparent in 2021. Other than a few small groups which have courageously taken up this task, the organized Jewish world largely failed to recognize that allowing these slanders to become entrenched in international discourse can have a catastrophic impact on Jewish security. This is partly a matter of underestimating the influence of the UN and its agencies, but the manner in which intersection ideology has taken hold of academia and, like most toxic ideas that begin on college campuses, then migrated to the public square, the delegitimization of Jewish nationalism, in which anti-Semitism has created a reality in which anti-Semitism has created a permission slip from intellectuals, activists, and opinion influencers in the media in a way that I believe would have been unimaginable, indeed unthinkable, more than 2 decades ago. But to acknowledge this failure is not to admit that the forces behind these toxic ideas cannot be defeated, or that the ultimate delegitimization of Zionism, Israel, and its supporters is an inevitability in a media environment in which fashionable opinion has embraced intersectionality. The effort to identify these ideas is not merely rooted in misinformation about the reality of Israel, but in a prejudiced mindset that has, to date, been allowed to thrive because of misplaced sympathy for perceived underdogs. But it would be mistaken to assume that simply because canards about Israel and Zionism have been adopted by the organs of the left and international institutions, that this means that the West will inevitably follow down the same path that the UN has trod since Durban. A dedicated effort to expose these tropes of Jew hatred to the scrutiny of the world has never really been attempted either by the organized Jewish world or sympathetic countries, or at least not yet in a manner that has made it much of an impact. What is needed is not more behind the scenes diplomacy and efforts to make friends among groups and nations that are in fact irredeemably skewed against Israel and for acceptance of anti-Semitism. Rather, what is needed is a forthright campaign by the Jewish world, Israel, and the people of goodwill everywhere to label anti-Zionist ideas and the apartheid Israel claim as not just lies, but lies that are the direct product of Jew hatred. There must be an end to the coddling of multilateral institutions and making excuses for them. It is time for anti-Semitism in international forums to be labeled as such by government and NGOs alike. When that happens, and it can if there is a sufficient will and willingness to expend political capital on this cause, then the defeat of those who have made Jew hatred mainstream again since Durban, I believe, is inevitable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And I appreciate your optimism. I have a few questions. The apartheid label is the product of Jew hatred, and the failure to connect the dots is where we've fallen short. Would you agree or disagree? And
yeah, I definitely do. This is not merely a matter of semantics. What has happened since Durban, and certainly it didn't just pop out of the earth, without forming, by itself, 20 years ago. There was plenty of lead up to it. What happened is that, the language was taken over. It wasn't just international organizations that have been hijacked by the Palestinians and others who share their desire to eradicate Israel. It's that they've won a lot of these language wars. They've been able to portray their cause in a way that is, as a cause for human rights rather than the denial of human rights. And I think we have to attack it directly on those lines. We cannot accept the premise that this is a case of David fighting the Israeli Goliath. We have to understand that what is at stake here is the legitimization of a form of hate and of deliberately twisting language and ideas in order to deny rights to Jews that frankly no one would think of denying to any other people. That is, I think, is the key to understanding not only what has happened, but how it can be fought.
And you also pointed out seems to have been a reluctance to label anti-Semitism as anti-Semitism, a reluctance that is evident in the United States as well as Israel. Why do you think that there is that reluctance, and what can we do to overcome it?
Well, when you phrase things, one of the reactions of debates about these sorts of issues from some people is inevitably to say, stop calling everything anti-Semitism, and you're being too extreme. You're trying to demonize legitimate criticism of Israel, but that's a snare, and in fact, it's false. This is about something very direct, but confronting it requires us to start out with some very difficult conclusions about who's on the other side and what their motives are. We in the West, and especially Jews in the West, we like everybody else, we like to project our own values, our own goals, even on those who are completely opposed to us, because we want to think that every issue can be solved. That's a very American thing. It's a very Jewish thing. But in fact, Understanding this conflict requires us to understand that there isn't a common goal here. The goals of the Palestinians, were it just a matter of a territorial dispute, it could have been solved decades ago. It's not. That's why it has moved into this ideological sphere. And their goal of eradicating Zionism, delegitimizing Zionism, treating Jewish self-determination as the one illegitimate form of self-determination, is completely, not merely counterintuitive to what the Jews want, it is exclusive to it. These two goals cannot be reconciled. Accepting that requires us to sort of discard some of the illusions that I think are the foundation of multilateralism and assumptions about diplomacy. And I think leaders in the organized Jewish world are as susceptible as career diplomats to not wanting to confront that truth. And that's why we are where we are.
The Islamic Republic of Iran also expresses its concerns over racism, racial discrimination, and apartheid against Muslims and Christians in the occupied Palestine, and needs to be urgently addressed by international community. Mr. President, in closing, my delegation once again emphasizes the equal inherent dignity of human beings.
Professor Gil Troy is Distinguished Scholar in North American History at McGill University, Canada, currently residing in Jerusalem. He is an award-winning American presidential historian. He was recently named one of the top 100 people positively influencing Jewish life. His book, Moynihan's Moment, America's Fight Against Zionism as Racism, describes the decline in the UN stature and the spread of anti-Zionism. His 2019 book, The Zionist Ideas, Visions for the Jewish Homeland, Then, Now, Tomorrow, was a National Jewish Book Award finalist. Thank you very much, Gil, for joining us.
I'm supposed to say it's a pleasure to be with you, but I'm actually devastated that we have to stand up in 2021 and say this is unacceptable. And it's particularly devastating because this big lie, this big red-green lie, communist inspired and Islamist embraced, this black and white lie that somehow Zionism is racism, has been making its way around the international community, poisoning the international bloodstream for decades. And there have been many people, Jewish and non-Jewish, from the left and from the right, black and white, who have said, this is not acceptable, this will not stand, and yet it continues to stand. Let's go back to 1975, when Israel's enemies, and frankly, America's enemies, trying to humiliate the United States of America at a moment when the United States was down because of South Vietnam, because of crime, because of inflation, because of Watergate. And the Soviet Union looked like it was on its way up. And they said, how can we humiliate the United States? Well, let's go to the United Nations and single out the United States' good friend, Israel, and attack Israel. And of course, the United Nations has to follow procedure. And so on October 17th, the third committee meets, and it considers this resolution, this insane resolution, singling out one form of nationalism, Zionism, Jewish nationalism, in the forum of nationalisms, at the time 142 countries of the United Nations, and says this form of nationalism, Jewish nationalism, is somehow racist. Representing the United States of America that day was Len Garment, an old friend of Richard Nixon, and now working for Gerald Ford, who was the president of the United States. And Len Garment, as a trial lawyer, had weighed what was the right word to use to describe what was happening in the United Nations. The United Nations, which was established in the wake of World War II to bring peace and justice and sanity to the world. The United Nations, which in 1947 had recognized the Jewish people's collective need to have a Jewish state. And he comes up with the word obscene. Why obscene? Because an obscenity is something that actually sullies us all. An obscenity is something that is so outrageous that it takes what should be normal and distorts it. And so Len Garment gets up as the representative to the third committee and says, this is obscene. And then the Israeli representative, the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Chaim Herzog, the father of the current president, Uzi Yitzchak Herzog, gets up. And he says, we shall not forget, and we shall never forgive. But he also points out, as Len Garment had, that this isn't just an attack on the Jewish people, but this is an attack on the United Nations and its core ideals and its founding visions. And if phrases like human rights, if words like racism become weaponized and become used simply to single out one country that at this moment is unpopular, then what do we do with those core words, those core values, those core ideals? They become sullied. That's why it's obscene, and that's why it's unforgivable. But inevitably, the fix was in, and the delegates vote to pass this obscene resolution on to the General Assembly. And the delegates break out in mocking applause. And there are even some dancing on tables. Chaim Herzog, anticipating this scene, had warned the other members of the Israeli delegation. And you know, Israelis can sometimes be a little hot-headed. He had said, you represent Israel, you represent the Jewish people, you represent democracy, do not show any emotion. And so they sit at their desks with their hands clasped, controlling themselves. But from across the room, a 6'5" academic, tousled hair, in a beautiful suit, stands up, the American ambassador to the United Nations, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a tough kid who grew up in the streets of New York, but had gone on to become a Harvard professor and had gone on to become an advisor to John Kennedy, to Lyndon Johnson, to Richard Nixon, to Gerald Ford, in a display of the kind of bipartisanship we desperately need. And Moynihan stretches, stands tall at 6'5", crosses the room, hugs his buddy, Chaim Herzog, and loudly mutters, fuck him. The New York Times reports that he embraced the Israeli ambassador. And when Moynihan would tell the story, he would say, I uttered an Anglo-Saxonism that cannot be reprinted. And then Herzog and Moynihan left the United Nations arm in arm, and his two Irishmen, Herzog had actually been born in Ireland when his father had been chief rabbi of Ireland. The two of them went off to the closest Irish bar and had a drink or two or three to toast democracy, to toast the Jewish people, to toast the relationship between the United States of America, which was going to resist this obscene assault on democracy, this obscene assault on decency. And I'm so very proud that at this moment in time, the United States has once again shown its friendship for Israel and boycotted this outrageous event. So that goes back to 1975. And then for 16 years, Daniel Patrick Moynihan works hard once he enters the Senate as a liberal Democratic senator from New York. He works in a bipartisan display, first with Ronald Reagan, and then with George H.W. Bush, and with a coalition of congressmen from left to right, religious, non-religious, black and white, to get that resolution rescinded. The General Assembly usually doesn't rescind resolutions. But in 1991, they did pass a law saying that this resolution, this obscene resolution, is no longer operable. And nevertheless, 10 years later, in 2001, in Durban in South Africa, in a conference against racism, rather than dealing with the serious issues around racism throughout the globe, too many delegates came there to single out one country, Israel, to single out one form of nationalism, Jewish nationalism, Zionism, and focus all their ire, all their outrage on Israel, on Zionism, on the Jewish people. In 1975, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, on November 10th, 1975, when I actually came to the well of the United Nations General Assembly, had stood up and said, the United States does not acknowledge, it will not abide by, it will never acquiesce in this infamous act. The phrase infamous act, of course, echoing Franklin Roosevelt and Pearl Harbor, because this really was a surprise attack, an attack on the Jewish people, an attack on democracy, attack on decency, attack on the UN itself. And so it's obvious why the United States and the United Kingdom and Canada and other countries stood up against it. But we're left with the historical mystery. Why did it take off? Why did it hold? Why did it survive that rhetorical onslaught of Moynihan and Herzog in 1975? How did it outlast the resolution being rescinded in 1991? How did it resurrect itself so strong in 2001? And there are two parts to the answer. One is that there has been a systematic campaign to single out one country, one form of nationalism, Israel, Jewish nationalism, and make Israel a pariah state, and make Jewish nationalism, Zionism, unkosher. And I'm sorry to say that it's building on centuries of Jew hatred, of anti-Semitism, both in the Christian world and in the Muslim world. The Christian world largely left anti-Semitism behind. Too many parts of the Muslim world didn't, and in fact gave it renewed life with the establishment of the State of Israel. And we see that anti-Semitism, Jew hatred, is not only the longest hatred, as the great Robert Wistrich, the great historian Robert Wistrich called it, but it's also the most plastic hatred. It's flexible. It's fungible. It's artificial. And it's sometimes lethal. And so when you want to find out who are the ultimate communists or the ultimate capitalists, the people who are too rich and the people who are too poor, the people who stand out too much and the people who fit in too much, you single out the Jew. And that was done for centuries in medieval Europe, in enlightened Europe, in the Muslim world, in the Arab countries. And in today's world, Israel has become the collective Jew, and the plastic hatred, the most plastic hatred, gloms onto it. And so if you hate racism, you say, ah, Zionism is racism. You hate imperialism, you say, ah, Israel is imperialist. You hate colonialism, you blame Israel. All these words lose their meaning when they're simply thrown at Israel. And so today, we have to gather and we have to say, this shall not stand. We will not acknowledge, we will not abide by, we will not acquiesce in this infamous act. And we have to do what I call a jujitsu, J-E-W. If they're going to turn Zionism into a dirty word, I'm going to re-embrace Zionism. And so I stand here today and I say, I am a Zionist. I am a Zionist because I am a Jew. And as a Jew, I understand that Judaism is a religion, but the Jewish people are a nation. And we are that unique mix of religion and nation. And you cannot single out one aspect of our integrated identity and Zionists bring it together. And I say I am a Zionist because I am a proud liberal nationalist. I look at nationalism as a collective opportunity to do good and as the best platform for building healthy, liberal democracies, democracies that dream, that soar, that aspire to be good. In Israel, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Australia, in Canada, in France. We're a small club of democracies, but we're proud of our liberal nationalism. And there are sometimes tensions, of course, but that's the beauty of life, the power of life. And I say, I am a Zionist because I am a Democrat, and I acknowledge the need for every individual to express themselves democratically. And I notice how lucky the Jewish people are to have come home and to establish a democracy, which is really a miracle, given the fact we've always been surrounded by so many enemies. And that so many Jews spent so many centuries in such undemocratic places. And yet we've come back to the land, to our homeland, to say we are a people, we have ties to a particular homeland, to a particular land, the Jewish land, Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, and we have the right to establish a state on that land. And finally, I say I am a Zionist because I believe in peace, and I believe in justice, and I believe in brotherhood and sisterhood. And I know that Israel, while it's not perfect, has worked so hard both to reach out to every single one of its inhabitants, Arab and Jew, Muslim, Christian, and Jew, using nation and religion as definitions. And also Israel has tried again and again and again to make peace. And so I call on all of us, as what happened on the streets of New York the day after the Zionism is Racism resolution, when they had a little rally and they were afraid that only 10,000 would show up, so they called it a youth rally. But instead, 100,000 people came, left and right, Jewish and non-Jewish, black and white, to say this shall not stand, to say we are Zionists, to say we are Democrats, to say we are liberal nationalists, to say we are standing for the righteous UN, the original UN, not the corrupted UN. And so I call on all of us, left and right, Jewish and non-Jewish, black and white, to create a coalition of good, a coalition of reason, to once again stand up against the lies of Durban, stand up against the lie that Zionism is racism, to stand up against the lies about Israel as some kind of evil state, and say we are so lucky to be living in the year 2021 with a proud, strong, idealistic Jewish state in friendship with its sister democracies. Thank you very much.
We attach great importance to the holding of Durban Review Conference in 2009. The Zionist regime continues and even intensifies its heinous crimes.
The measures against the Palestinian people, including the construction of apartheid wall, are manifesting the prevalence of a racist regime in that territory.
Noah Shufutinsky is a recent graduate of the George Washington University, where he earned his BA in Judaic Studies. On campus, he was heavily involved in Jewish life and Zionist activism. Noah is also known by his stage name, West Side Gravy. As an artist, he fuses his passion for Jewish culture and history with his lived experience of growing up Black and Jewish across the US to write and produce hip-hop. Through unapologetic songs like Diaspora, Angry Black Men, and Yahud, West Side represents his roots
and illustrates the importance of using art to communicate the history of his people. Thank you so much for being with us today.
My name is Noah Shufutinsky, and I'm also a hip-hop recording artist by the name of Westside Gravy. I use my music as an outlet to tell stories related to my lived experiences and identity. My Black and Jewish upbringing has informed a lot of the views I express in my songs, and it's very apparent in a piece I wrote about 3 years ago called Diaspora. Growing up, I always understood the importance of maintaining a connection to homeland, be that the region of West Africa where my ancestors were kidnapped from, brought to North America, and stripped of many elements of our culture, or Israel, where my ancestors were exiled from and forced to assimilate into the diaspora. The fact that I'm still able to connect to my roots is due to the dedication of generations before me, who sacrificed to give me the opportunities I have to embrace my background. A very important factor in this process of liberation is Zionism. The yearning to return to our indigenous homeland is what kept my people in touch with our culture, from the USSR to the cities of America. Framing this now fulfilled dream of Jewish liberation as anything other than social justice is ignorant at best and malicious at worst. Zionism as a movement dates back thousands of years to the moments immediately after the first exile of Judah. It has manifested itself in many different ways in very different diaspora communities and has always been an integral part of Jewish identity. The redefinition of Zionism by outside influences is dangerous and anti-Semitic, as well as blatantly patronizing to the Jewish community. It isn't something that can be framed as right-wing or left-wing because it predates those very notions. The misrepresentation of Jewish peoplehood in our ancestral land as racism is racist in itself for forcing an anachronistic and Eurocentric concept onto an indigenous Levantine people. In my song Diaspora, I was inspired to write about this after dealing with efforts to redefine my Jewish identity by fellow students on my university campus. It's important for me to highlight that in spite of efforts to speak over us and negatively portray our identity in a politically convenient light, it's important for us to control the narrative as Jewish people. Our Zionism is our liberation. It's our justice. It's the ideological and physical lifeline of our nation, and it exists independently of partisan political causes, and we have every right to define it for ourselves.
Proud part of the diaspora, we ain't gon' play the victim. They get mad every time we're standing up. I'm proud of my people, what we accomplished. You're crazy if you think some rocket barrages will stop us. Look through our history and we've been through it all. Made it through slavery and a Holocaust and still standing tall. At the Kotel Western Wall, saying the Shema, meditating on all the populations to whom this song is dedicated. 6 Jewish families that resided in Khartoum. My Iraqi brothers and sisters survived the Farhud. The ones who came in 56 from Israel, now we're thriving. Garim Berushalayim. וגם בחיפה, הגולן ותל אביב, באר שבע, בהנגב ואילת by the sea. אתה יודע שלא שכחתי האתיופים שעשו את הכל, מה אתם אומרים שהם לא יכולים? I'm a proud part of the diaspora. In my heart I hold Jerusalem and Africa. Kicked us out of our land and started gassing us till we put our foot down cause we had enough. Check out the flag that I'm waving, 2 blue stripes and a huge star of David. Check out the flag that I'm waving. Keep shooting rockets, but you never gon' take it. Here I'm talking about the Jews will not replace us on college campuses that been trying to erase us. And all that BDS campaigning, we've dealt with worse problems and racist associations of students all acting stupid and thinking they're making differences, picking and choosing truths and not knowing what real resistance is. Say you value social justice, are you kidding us? What the hell gives you the right to tell me who's indigenous? You don't have it, you just assume the privilege of looking at other people and telling them what their image is. You want the image to fit your twisted narrative, but your divide and conquer tactics ain't scaring this diaspora, of which I'm a proud part. I got blue and white in my veins running through my heart. And they get mad when we're surviving. The truth is, only way they like a Jew is if they're dying. So I'ma say this by the candlelight. Take a moment and remember the fallen for their sacrifice. Never again, never forget. They wanted us dead, we rose from the ashes instead. מלמדים ההיסטוריה מדור לדור. לא יהיה לנו עתיד אם לא נזכור. We wouldn't have a future if we didn't have a past. So every day we gotta take a minute and honor those who passed. Then wake up determined, cause we're returning to the ways that they tried to erase, that we're preserving. Scattered in the wind in diaspora conditions, still maintain connection to our traditions. From Morocco to Havana to Yemen, living in Aden, Ciudad de Mexico, Buenos Aires, we're all one nation. Through all of the oppression that they threaten, trying to shatter us, I'm still a proud part of the diaspora. I'm a proud part of the diaspora. In my heart I hold Jerusalem in Africa. Kicked us out of our land and started gassing us, till we put our foot down cause we had enough. Check out the flag that I'm waving, 2 blue stripes and a huge star of David. Check out the flag that I'm waving, keep shooting rockets but you never gon' take it.